It was 1709. John Wesley was 6 years old when the rectory at Epworth caught fire in the night. The family escaped. The boy did not. His father searched the ground floor and found nothing. He went into the courtyard, knelt in the cold, and committed his son to God. And then a neighbor looked up and saw him. The boy, at the upstairs window, the flames behind him, looking down. They could not reach him with a ladder. So one man stood against the wall, and another climbed him like a ladder and pulled the child from the window. Seconds before the roof collapsed. His mother, Susanna, would later write that she believed God had preserved him for a purpose. She called him a brand plucked from the burning, words drawn from the prophet Zechariah, a piece of wood rescued from the fire before it was consumed. She was right, but not in the way either of them expected. What you are about to encounter is not the version of this story that gets told at anniversary services and in seminary introductions. This is the interior version, the one that asks what it cost him, the one that follows the fire, not just where it spread, but where it burned the man who carried it. If you want to follow this story with us, subscribe to Burning Heart Studio. We revisit the lives of faith that history softened. We stay until we find what the surface missed. The boy who was pulled from that window grew into a man of extraordinary discipline. At Oxford, he and his brother Charles formed what their peers mockingly called the Holy Club, a small group of students who fasted, visited prisons, studied the scriptures with methodical precision, and generally made a nuisance of themselves. By taking the Christian life seriously, they were called Methodists as an insult. The name stuck. But the discipline was not merely public. Every morning, before 5 o'clock, Wesley was already awake. He had been keeping a journal since his early 20s, not as diary, not as memoir, but as something closer to a spiritual ledger. Each day, he logged whether he had prayed with full attention, whether he had felt anything during the scripture reading, whether the silence of morning had felt like God's presence, or like an empty room. He noted the interior temperature of his own soul, with the same precision a naturalist applies to the sky, recording not just what had happened, but what it had cost him to feel it, or to feel nothing at all. He would maintain this practice for more than 50 years, before the circuits, before the open fields, before the crowds that would number in the tens of thousands. Every day, in the pre-dawn dark, the journal open on the desk, the candle lit beside it. The same question asked again, quietly, honestly, is this real? Am I reaching toward something real? He preached to the Holy Club as if he believed it. He wrote in the journal as if he was not entirely sure. And beneath all of it, beneath the discipline and the devotion, and the careful management of his own spiritual record, there was a question he could not silence. Was God actually there? Not the theology, not the method, not the idea of God he could defend in an argument. Was he actually there? In 1735, John Wesley boarded a ship for Georgia. He was 32 years old, ordained, educated, and as certain as a man, with a persistent private doubt can afford to appear, that God had called him to bring the gospel to the native peoples of the American colonies. He went as a missionary. He came back as something else entirely. A storm hit mid-ocean, the kind that made experienced sailors believe they were going to die. Wesley believed it too, and in the terror of that moment, he noticed something that would not leave him. A group of Moravian passengers singing hymns in the dark, while the water came over the sides, not performing courage, not pretending the storm was manageable, singing because they were not afraid to die. He asked one of them afterward, "Were you not afraid?" The man looked at him, calm and genuine. "No." "Are you?" Wesley had no honest answer. The Georgia mission was a documented failure. He alienated the colonial settlers with the kind of rigorous spiritual discipline they had not asked for. And then there was Sophia Hopke, the niece of the local magistrate, a young woman Wesley spent hours teaching French, deliberated over endlessly, and could not bring himself to propose to. She married someone else. Wesley refused her communion. Her husband filed charges. The community turned. And John Wesley, Oxford educated, Church of England ordained, son of a mother who believed God had marked him, fled Georgia in the night. He wrote in his journal on the return voyage, "I went to America to convert the Indians. But who shall convert me?" It was the most honest sentence he had written in 32 years. Back in London, a Moravian minister named Peter Blur sat with Wesley and told him something. He was not ready to hear that the faith he had been pursuing through discipline was available as a gift, that he could stop earning it. Wesley argued. Of course he argued. Blur told him, "Preach faith till you have it, and then, because you have it, you will preach faith." Wesley preached, and waited, and wrote in the journal each morning that he had offered what he did not yet fully possess. On the evening of May 24th, 1738, at a small society meeting on Aldersgate Street in London, someone was reading aloud from Luther's preface to the Book of Romans. Wesley wrote what happened while they read. "I felt my heart strangely warmed, not converted in a dramatic public scene, not struck by lightning, not visited by an angel, in a small room, listening to someone else read. The same heart that had doubted for 30 years was finally, quietly, warm." But a warming is not a guarantee, and what Wesley would discover in the years that followed was that the fire which had finally found him would cost him things he was not yet prepared to lose. By 1739, the Church of England had effectively closed its pulpits to Wesley, so he went outside. He stood in a field in Bristol and preached to coal miners at dawn, men who had been told, in ways both explicit and quiet, that the church was not for them. He submitted, as he recorded in his journal, to this more vile method with great reluctance. They wept. He kept going. But what followed in those outdoor meetings was something Wesley had not planned for, and, initially, did not know what to do with. People began to fall, not faint, not weep quietly and compose themselves. They dropped to the ground, they cried out, they shook, they lay still for minutes at a time, and rose speaking of something lifted from them, a weight they had carried so long, they had stopped believing it could be set down. Wesley documented every instance. With the same meticulous care he brought to his private journals, he was a trained Oxford theologian. His instinct, when confronted with something he could not explain, was skepticism. Not the pious kind that avoids difficult questions, the genuine kind that demands answers. He consulted physicians, he went to the witnesses, he cross-examined each person carefully, pressing for the exact nature and sequence of what they had felt, looking for any pattern that might point to a natural cause. The public called it fanaticism. Anglican clergy called it disorder. Philosophers called it mass hysteria. Wesley called it inconclusive, until he had examined every case and could no longer locate a natural explanation equal to what he had observed. Then, slowly, carefully, with the reluctance of a man who does not want to be made to believe something before he has earned the right to believe it, he wrote in his journal that he could not account for what he had seen, by any means his training had given him, and that he was unwilling to attribute to the flesh what appeared to belong to something else entirely. He did not sensationalize it. He never built a movement around the falling. He did not use it to draw crowds or to build reputation. But he did not deny what he had seen and documented. He simply noted it. in the same careful hand that noted everything else, and kept preaching. What was happening in those fields, in Bristol, in Newcastle, across the Midlands, was what historians would come to call one of the most significant spiritual awakenings in the English-speaking world. Wesley characteristically called it one documented case at a time, because through all of it, through the outdoor meetings and the theological arguments, and the bodies that fell and rose again in the open air, Wesley kept rising before 5, kept writing in the journal, kept auditing the interior whether he had felt anything, whether the silence had felt like absence or like waiting. The private discipline was not separate from the public fire. It was the root system beneath it. But what the histories of this revival rarely record, what most documentaries on Wesley's life step carefully around, is what the movement cost him personally, not the mobs, not the closed churches, not the theological arguments or the exhausting miles. Those costs were visible. The invisible ones were harder. Her name was Grace Murray. She was a Methodist class leader, intelligent, deeply committed, gifted in ministry, and the woman John Wesley, at 45 years old, genuinely loved. He wrote that she was in every way suited to me. He intended to marry her. Wesley's brother Charles, fearing that a marriage would damage the perception of the ministry, moved quickly and without John's knowledge to arrange Grace Murray's marriage to another Methodist preacher. By the time Wesley arrived, it was done. He wept. He wrote in his journal that he had never felt such a bitterness of spirit in his life. He grieved privately. He preached publicly because there was nothing else to do. A year later, he married Mary Vazay, a widow, a woman of means. Within months, the relationship began to fracture. Mary read his private letters, followed him on the road. Wesley bore this quietly, the way a man bears what he cannot fix and cannot leave. He wrote once, "I have not left her. I will not leave her, but I dare not stay with her." She eventually left him. He received the news on the road. He wrote 2 lines in his journal and kept riding. He had always taught that grace could do more than begin a person, that it could, over time, so fill a heart. That love, genuine, other-directed, costly love, became its governing motion, rather than its occasional achievement. Not the absence of struggle, not sinless perfection. A heart so fully oriented toward God and neighbor that fear finally loses its grip. He called it perfect love. He had watched it happen in others, quietly, without fanfare, and he was still privately reaching for it himself. The fire that had been given to him had not made his life easier, it had made it lonelier, and yet the question beneath all of it, the one he had been asking, since the window in Epworth, since the storm on the Atlantic, since the small room on Aldersgate Street, was still there. What happens when the man begins to tire, and the fire keeps spreading anyway? He was 60 years old. He was still on horseback. In the 1760s, John Wesley was averaging 8,000 miles a year. He rose before 5. He preached multiple times a day. He administered a movement that now stretched across Britain and had begun to take root in the American colonies, a movement he had not designed for this scale, had not fully planned for, and could not, if he had tried, contain. By the 1780s, the Methodist societies, numbered in the hundreds across Britain and America, tens of thousands of members, hundreds of lay preachers, circuits that stretched from Bristol to Baltimore. He had stopped trying to contain it. George Whitefield had been Wesley's friend, his fellow field preacher, and, in the most consequential theological argument of the early Methodist movement, his opponent. Whitefield believed that God elected specific souls to salvation, Wesley believed that grace was available to every soul without exception. They argued with the passion of men, who both understood the stakes were eternal. They also, remarkably, kept loving each other. When Whitefield died in 1770, Wesley preached his funeral sermon. He said of the man who had disagreed with him, "On some of the deepest questions in Christian theology, have we read or heard of any person, since the apostles, who called so many souls from darkness to light?" He meant it. This was Wesley at his most mature, a man who had learned to love what he could not fully agree with and to honor what he could not fully control. In 1784, Wesley did something that could not be undone. He ordained Thomas Coke as superintendent for the Methodist societies in America. The Church of England had not authorized this. It had not been asked. Wesley believed the situation demanded it. The American colonies now independent, the Anglican Church there effectively collapsed, and thousands of Methodist believers, with no ordained leadership to serve them. His brother Charles called it a step too far. The bishops called it a breach. Wesley called it obedience. He had spent his entire life trying to reform the Church of England from within. He had insisted to the last that the Methodist movement was not a new denomination, but a renewal within an existing one. And yet here he was, ordaining, establishing, building, something that had its own weight and momentum, and would, within a few years of his death, become a church in its own right. He had not wanted this. He had also, in some way, made it inevitable. That is the nature of a fire. Given away rather than managed, it does not stay where you put it. He kept riding, into his 70s, into his 80s. The handwriting in his journals changed, grew larger, less controlled, the hand of a man whose body was beginning to negotiate terms with time. But the frequency did not decrease. There is a record of Wesley preaching, at the age of 86, standing in the open air, still making the same argument he had made in a field in Bristol 40 years earlier, that grace was not something you earned, but something you received. Still saying it, as if someone in the crowd still needed to hear it for the first time. Someone always did. Now it was late. The body was failing, the journals were quieter, and the question he had first asked, in a storm on the Atlantic, the one that had never fully left him, was still there. Not what have I built, but was he with me? He was 87 years old. He was still writing. In 1774, decades before his death, Wesley had published Thoughts Upon Slavery, a treatise most of his admirers did not know how to receive. He had read the testimonies. He had studied the ledgers. He had looked at the machinery of the trade, the ships, the chains, the calculations, and he had written in plain and terrible language what the church around him was too comfortable to say plainly, that no human being could be bought, that any Christian who profited from this system had not yet understood the gospel he claimed to preach. It cost him readers. He wrote it anyway. He had stopped trying to be liked, somewhere around the age of 35, when he stood in a field in Bristol and preached to coal miners at dawn, because there was no other option. He had learned, slowly and at great personal cost, that faithfulness and approval are not the same thing. So he wrote the letter. February 24th, 1791. 6 days before his death, John Wesley took up his pen from a bed he would not rise from again and wrote to a young member of Parliament named William Wilberforce, a man who had staked his career on ending the transatlantic slave trade and was, in those weeks, beginning to feel the weight of a battle that showed no sign of ending. Wesley told him to press on. He called the trade that execrable villainy. He told Wilberforce that he believed, with the conviction of a man who has nothing left to prove, that God had raised him up for this very purpose, and that to abandon it now would be to abandon the people God had placed in his hands. Then he set the pen down. He had said what needed to be said. There was nothing left to earn. On March 2nd, 1791, surrounded by friends and by the sound of prayer, John Wesley gathered himself one final time. Those in the room described a stillness that had not been there before, not the stillness of emptiness, but the stillness of arrival, as if something long sought had finally, quietly, been found. The man who had spent 50 years teaching others to receive what he was still reaching for, had at the last received it. The man who had once written, with the honesty of someone who could not afford to lie to himself, that he had gone to America to convert the Indians and come back asking who would convert him, died in the full assurance of the thing he had spent his entire life reaching for, not because he had finally earned it, but because he had finally stopped believing he needed to. He had ridden 250,000 miles. He had preached 40,000 sermons. He had buried a marriage he could not save. He had released a movement he could not contain. He had kept going, long after a reasonable man would have stopped. Now he stopped. And what he said, what those in the room recorded and passed on and have not let go of since, was 5 words. Best of all, God is with us. Then he was gone. The fire that had frightened him as a boy, at the window in Epworth, the fire that had warmed his heart, in a small room on Aldersgate Street, the fire he had carried across a nation on horseback for 50 years, did not go out when he did. It had already been given away. Every sermon, every circuit, every letter, every miner who looked up from the dark and saw light on someone's face and thought, perhaps there is something to this after all. The fire was never his to keep. The question John Wesley spent 87 years answering is the same question most of us are still circling at the edges of, afraid to ask it directly, afraid of what the silence might say back. Not am I doing enough, but is he with me? And the only honest answer, the one Wesley found not in his striving, but in his surrender, is the one he spoke with his last breath. If you are still trying to earn what has already been freely given, this is your invitation to stop. Not to do less, but to receive first, and then to go the way Wesley went, with open hands and a burning heart, and the quiet, unshakable knowledge that the one who called you has never once let go. These stories are themselves part of the fire, the same fire Wesley gave away, one circuit, one letter, one life at a time. Keeping them alive cost something. If this film moved you, consider supporting the work of Burning Heart Studio so that stories like this one can keep being told. And if you are unable to do that, we ask for something even more important. Pray for us. Pray that these videos ignite a fire in this generation. We are Burning Heart Studio, and we believe the best stories are the ones still being lived.